By the summer of 1942, the Pacific Ocean had become the stage for one of the most decisive confrontations of the Second World War. After the rapid expansion of the Imperial Japanese Navy, its power seemed unstoppable. Singapore had fallen, Pearl Harbor was still a painful memory, and the Philippines were under Japanese control. It appeared that the Pacific would soon become an internal sea of the Japanese Empire. Yet behind this image of dominance, fatigue and overextension were beginning to show. Japan's fleet stretched across thousands of miles, requiring constant fuel, supplies, and coordination. The United States, still reeling from early defeats, was mobilizing its vast industrial potential. Time was no longer on Japan's side. In those months, a series of decisions began to take shape that would lead to what historians later called the turning point of the Pacific War, the Battle of Midway. Midway Atoll itself was little more than two small strips of coral with an airstrip and a few supply depots, but its position made it strategically vital. Whoever controlled it would command the Central Pacific routes and the approaches to Hawaii. For the Japanese command, Midway represented an opportunity to destroy what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and force America into negotiation. The plan, known as Operation MI, was intended to replicate the surprise and efficiency of Pearl Harbor, but this time to eliminate the American aircraft carriers entirely. The Japanese High Command placed full faith in its planning and discipline. Admirals Nagumo and Yamamoto, veterans of the Navy, trusted in precision and coordination. Every movement, every timing of the attack was calculated to the minute. Yet even the most perfect plan can collapse from a single, seemingly trivial error. A miscommunication too small to notice until it is too late. The Americans, on the other hand, faced the battle with limited resources. After the disaster at Pearl Harbor, only 3 carriers remained operational: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. Admiral Chester Nimitz made a risky decision to rely on cryptanalysts to uncover Japan's next move. Radio intelligence became the silent weapon of the Pacific. Intercepted Japanese transmissions repeatedly mentioned a target codenamed AF. The challenge was to find out what AF meant. In May 1942, U.S. intelligence conducted a simple yet ingenious test. The Midway garrison was instructed to send an unencrypted radio message reporting that their water desalination system had broken down. A day later, Japanese radio transmitted an encrypted report stating that AF is short of fresh water. The code was broken. AF was Midway. This revelation changed everything. The Americans now knew the target, the timing, and even parts of the Japanese battle plan. Nimitz acted swiftly. He ordered his carriers to take position northeast of the atoll, setting an ambush for the approaching fleet. His plan was dangerous but elegant. Let the Japanese begin their attack, then strike their carriers when their decks were crowded with refueling and rearming aircraft. Meanwhile, in the Japanese headquarters, confidence reigned. Their commanders believed the Americans were unaware of the operation. Reconnaissance reports were incomplete, but the Imperial Navy trusted its own secrecy. Midway was considered a formality, a final blow to American resistance. Yet within this careful machine of schedules and signals, a chain of misunderstandings was already forming, one that would soon unravel the entire operation. At dawn, on the 4th of June 1942, the Japanese strike force approached Midway. The weather was clear, the sea calm. Aboard the carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, preparations for the first wave were complete. At exactly 4:30 a.m., the first bombers took off, their engines echoing over the endless ocean. Within minutes, explosions tore across the small atoll. Smoke columns rose over the runways as American anti-aircraft fire answered from below. Far to the northeast, the U.S. carriers lay hidden, undetected. The Japanese had dispatched scout planes to locate enemy forces. but one reconnaissance aircraft launched nearly 30 minutes late. That delay, barely half an hour, would become one of the most consequential in naval history. As reports came in from Midway, Admiral Nagumo faced a critical choice. His first strike had damaged but not destroyed the American base. He ordered his crews to rearm planes for a second attack on the island. Then, suddenly, a report arrived from the overdue scout plane. Enemy fleet sighted. But the message was vague, lacking detail. The pilot had not specified what kind of ships he had seen, carriers or smaller vessels. The wording was unclear, the coordinates incomplete. That small gap in understanding a simple failure of communication began to spread through the Japanese command like an unseen current. Orders conflicted, weapons were changed, and minutes slipped away. Under the bright Pacific sun, with perfect weather and perfect visibility, the seeds of disaster had already been sown. The sun rose higher over the calm Pacific. On the Japanese carriers, the air was filled with heat, oil, and the smell of aviation fuel. Below the deck, armorers worked in narrow spaces, replacing torpedoes with bombs, preparing for a second strike on Midway. Every movement followed procedure, every order precise. But timing was everything, and time was beginning to slip away. Admiral Nagumo's staff received two contradictory messages within minutes. The first, from the Midway attack group, reported that the island's defenses were still active, more bombers would be needed to finish the job. The second, from a long-delayed reconnaissance plane, claimed that enemy ships were sighted to the northeast. The message was incomplete, the coordinates unclear, and the classification missing. Were they destroyers, cruisers, or carriers? The operator had transmitted only part of his observation before radio interference cut him off. In the command room, officers debated the meaning of the report. Some believed it referred to a small patrol group. Others warned that it might signal the approach of the American fleet. Nagumo hesitated. Doctrine demanded certainty before changing strike plans. His air groups were already half rearmed for another land attack. To prepare them instead for naval combat would require unloading bombs, reloading torpedoes, refueling, and rearming, a process taking nearly an hour. The admiral's decision was to wait. He ordered his scouts to confirm the sighting and delayed launching the next wave. But as the planes stood idle on the decks, the ships themselves became vulnerable. Fuel lines snaked across the carrier floors, bombs were stacked in corridors, and the crews, exhausted and sweating, worked under pressure to meet conflicting orders. The smallest spark could have ignited disaster. Meanwhile, far above the ocean, American scout planes from Enterprise and Yorktown were already searching the same patch of sea. They reported the Japanese fleet's location within minutes. Their radio signals reached Admiral Nimitz's headquarters at Pearl Harbor, confirming what his analysts had predicted. The ambush was working. Back on Akagi, confusion deepened. At 7:28 a.m., the delayed scout plane finally transmitted a full report. Enemy force includes carriers. The meaning was now clear: the Americans were near. But Nagumo's deck crews had already begun rearming for another strike on Midway. To change plans again would take precious time. The admiral, still unsure of the exact number of enemy ships, ordered to complete the rearming before launching a counterattack. This hesitation lasted barely 20 minutes, yet in battle, 20 minutes could decide everything. During that interval, the first waves of American torpedo bombers began their desperate, low-altitude attacks. They came in scattered formations, launched too early, with little coordination. Most never returned, yet their sacrifice drew the Japanese fighters down to sea level, away from the clouds where another danger was forming. At 10:20 a.m., dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared high above the Japanese carriers. Guided by a chance sighting, they dove almost vertically through the clouds. Below them, the decks were still crowded with fueled aircraft and armed bombs. In less than 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in fire. The explosions were catastrophic, amplified by the stored munitions and open fuel lines. The shock spread through the fleet like a physical blow. From a tactical standpoint, it was more than just a surprise attack. It was the result of accumulated minutes of delays, uncertainty, and a single incomplete message. The scouts' vague report, misunderstood by operators, misread by officers, and misjudged by command, had led to a fatal misalignment of timing. When the flames reached the fuel tanks, sailors threw themselves into the sea. The sky above Midway darkened with smoke. Only Hiryu remained operational, desperately launching counterstrikes. The balance of power in the Pacific began to shift in those very moments. What history would later call luck was, in truth, a chain of small human errors. One man's hesitation, another's miscommunication, a delay in radio contact multiplied by the scale of war. The Pacific, vast and indifferent, simply reflected those choices. By midday, the decisive phase of the battle had begun, and the fate of the Japanese fleet was already sealed, though no one on either side yet understood it. The morning sky above Midway turned from clear blue to smoke gray. Columns of flame rose from 3 Japanese carriers, their decks engulfed in fire. The Pacific, once calm, now reflected the burning wreckage of what had been the core of the Imperial Navy's striking power. Within an hour, the battle that was meant to end American resistance had turned into disaster. On Akagi, the pride of the fleet, the fire spread from the hangar deck to the command bridge. Bombs that had been readied for launch detonated in rapid succession. The ship shuddered as internal explosions tore through her hull. Attempts to contain the fire failed. The heat was too intense, the fuel too volatile. The crew fought in silence, following procedure until escape was no longer possible. Within minutes, the ship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was beyond saving. Nearby, Kaga and Soryu burned as well. The concentrated dive-bombing attacks had struck their decks at precisely the worst moment when aircraft were refueling, ammunition lay exposed, and the defensive fighters were still engaged at low altitude. The result was total chaos. Pilots who had trained for years, officers who had survived dozens of missions, now found themselves trapped in the steel furnaces of their own ships. At sea level, oil fires spread across the waves, creating a drifting barrier of black smoke. Lifeboats struggled through the flames, filled with men covered in soot and oil. From above, American aircraft circled, observing the destruction below, unaware of the magnitude of what they had achieved. To them, it was another attack order fulfilled, another target neutralized. Only the carrier Hiryu remained intact. Her flight deck was clear, her air group still operational. Acting swiftly, her commander ordered counterstrikes. 2 waves of bombers were launched, one targeting Yorktown, the other searching for additional American carriers. The counterattack was fierce and disciplined, striking the Yorktown twice before noon. The American ship burned but refused to sink. Damage control teams fought the fires relentlessly, and by afternoon she was back underway, scarred but afloat. At the same time, American scout planes located Hiryu. Guided by radio reports, a new group of dive bombers was dispatched from Enterprise. They arrived late in the day, when the sky had darkened with smoke, and the sea was littered with debris. At 5 p.m., they dived out of the clouds. 4 direct hits tore through Hiryu's deck, igniting her fuel stores. Within minutes, she joined the others in flames. The last operational carrier of the Japanese strike force was lost. The battle was effectively over. The Japanese fleet withdrew to the west, escorting a handful of surviving destroyers and cruisers. The once proud First Air Fleet, the same force that had shocked the world 6 months earlier, had been annihilated in a single day. On the American side, the victory came with disbelief. The pilots, exhausted and disoriented, landed on their carriers without realizing the scale of their success. They had acted on instinct, improvisation, and fragments of intelligence. The precision of their timing, which seemed impossible, had in fact been shaped by the enemy's confusion. the miscommunication that delayed Japanese response by only minutes, but altered everything. In the evening, the Pacific grew quiet again. The fires on the horizon faded into dull red glows. The waves carried debris, broken rafts, scattered aircraft parts, drifting oil slicks. The air was heavy with the smell of fuel and burnt metal. The ocean had swallowed the sound of engines, leaving only wind and distant thunderclouds. What remained was not triumph, but realization. In the space of hours, 4 Japanese carriers had been lost, along with hundreds of planes and irreplaceable crews. The Imperial Navy would never again recover its full striking strength. The Americans, too, understood that this victory was not the result of perfection but of chance, a sequence of human errors amplified by scale and circumstance. As night fell over the Pacific, both sides began to count their dead. The battle had lasted less than a day, but it had changed the balance of the war. From a single unclear message, from hesitation measured in minutes, history had turned. When dawn came over the Pacific, the sea looked calm again, as if nothing had happened. Only drifting oil slicks and faint smoke on the horizon hinted at the destruction that had taken place. The Japanese fleet, reduced and silent, moved westward. On its decks lay the wounded and the exhausted, men who had survived fire, water, and disbelief. For them, the war had not ended, but something irreversible had changed. Admiral Nagumo, once a symbol of precision and discipline, watched the horizon from the bridge of his escorting cruiser. Reports came in one after another. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all lost. The figures seemed abstract, impossible to grasp. The First Air Fleet, which had represented the power and pride of the Empire, no longer existed. The few aircraft that remained circled above the fleet, like restless shadows. Messages to the combined fleet command were brief and restrained. No explanations were given, no details provided, only casualty lists and coordinates. For the Japanese Navy, accustomed to victory, this silence carried more weight than words. The realization came slowly, a recognition that control, discipline, and planning could not prevent the chaos of chance. Far to the east, the American fleet regrouped near Midway. The atoll itself lay scarred and smoking, its runways pitted with craters, its garrison exhausted but intact. For Admiral Nimitz and his officers, the victory felt less like triumph and more like relief. They had gambled everything: 3 carriers, limited fuel, incomplete intelligence, and somehow prevailed. When the first reports arrived in Pearl Harbor, even senior commanders hesitated to believe them. 4 enemy carriers destroyed in one day seemed beyond possibility. In Washington, analysts began to reevaluate the Pacific War. Midway had not merely been a battle won, it was a strategic reversal. Japan had lost its initiative, its most experienced aviators, and the logistical advantage it had enjoyed since 1941. From this point on, it would fight defensively. The tide had turned, not through overwhelming strength, but through timing, intelligence, and a moment of hesitation deep in the enemy's chain of command. Historians would later trace the turning point back to a single report, the delayed scout message that reached Nagumo too late, too vague to act upon. The pilot's brief description, the operator's incomplete transmission, the admiral's cautious interpretation. None of them alone were fatal. Yet together, they formed a thread of miscommunication that changed the course of the war. For the men who fought at Midway, those nuances meant little. They remembered only the noise, the heat, the blinding smoke, and the loss of friends. Survivors from both sides carried those memories in silence. In the years that followed, some spoke of luck, others of destiny. But behind all interpretations lay the same truth. Wars are shaped not only by weapons and strategy, but by moments when human understanding falters. By midsummer, the Pacific had begun to heal. The wrecks sank slowly into the depths, their outlines vanishing beneath shifting currents. Fish swam through twisted metal, and coral began to grow on the remains of decks and engines. The ocean absorbed everything: the noise, the flame, the history. Above it, life went on. In Japan, the news of the defeat was softened by official statements. The full scale of the loss was not immediately revealed. Yet, among naval officers, the meaning was clear. The empire had reached its limit of expansion. The war would continue, but the path forward had changed. For the United States, Midway became a symbol proof that knowledge, timing, and persistence could overcome greater power. The battle was studied, documented, and remembered, not for its heroism, but for its lesson, that a single human error, magnified by circumstance, can redirect the course of history. In the quiet after the storm, the Pacific stretched endless and still. Beneath it lay the remains of fleets and men, reminders of how fragile precision becomes amid confusion. The miscommunication that had seemed small, almost meaningless, had rewritten the balance of an ocean. And so, from that moment onward, every commander who studied Midway would remember not the explosion, nor the victory, but the silence that followed it.